Hare Om Namaha. Om Hari Vidas Yan Mama Sarva Rakshang Niyastangri Padmaha Padagendra Prishte. Om Jnana Timirandhasya Jnananjana Shalakaya Chakshurunmilitang Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha. The three modes of material nature manifest as matter, knowledge, and activity. They put the eternally transcendental living entity under the conditions of material cause and effect. These modes also make him, at least provisionally, responsible for his activities unless and until he accepts a genuine guru and thus learns the spiritual art of how to dovetail the modes. On the flip side of the coin, when the modes are actually binding but appear to be dovetailed in devotional service, many big problems ensue, especially for those misled by the pretenders who are benefiting from the sham. People forget that His Divine Grace, Srila Prabhupada, warned about these problems many times, especially in his letters. Due to being saturated in an attitude of lording it over the disciples of Srila Prabhupada, the real workers, Sahajis, covert Mayavadis, and various kinds of sociopaths, all pretending to be advanced devotees, are actually situated in the lower modes of material nature, although they may pretend to be fixed in the mode of goodness. As such, they make sure that all the unfortunates who follow them also remain in the lower modes, because they mistakenly believe that these leaders are advanced transcendentalists or even gurus. The covering of material nature is so constant that it appears that all of these people must eternally remain ignorant of their actual spiritual glory. Such is the Maya, which tears them all away from the absolute truth via her powerful servants, and bogus gurus being the worst of the lot, and then covers the followers all up with her Avaranatmaka Shakti. This Avaranatmaka Shakti covering is manifest in the form of material cause and effect. But the unfortunate followers, as well as their leaders, cannot see this. Instead, they think that their actions are transcendental and that the results and effects are actually benedictions when they are anything but. This eventually leads to severe suffering on the part of the followers in particular. Basically, the cheap guru, cheap disciple syndrome gains its initial traction in the mode of passion, but soon enough it descends into the mode of ignorance. A human being with this rare opportunity of human life is meant to become a devoted transcendentalist. He or she is meant to completely transcend the influence of institutional and wildcard gurus, and he or she is meant to become completely liberated from the three modes of material nature. He or she is meant for the attainment of the highest spiritual and devotional perfection. But material activities, of course, prevent this development. Such activities are caused when the Mahatattva internally is stirred, but any genuine transcendentalist knows how to avoid that. On the other hand, those who are implicated in the cheap guru, cheap disciple syndrome feed off of such Mahatattva agitation for their so-called bliss, and at least in the early stages, the mode of passionate is prominent in most of them. Eventually, the pretenders and the followers degrade into the mode of ignorance because the Supreme Personality of Servitor Godhead, His Lordship Shiva, is the father of all material activities. As such, the cult of cheap guru, cheap disciple, thus implicates all of these people in the lower mode in due course of time. Because His Divine Grace, Srila Prabhupada, foresaw the distinct possibility, nay, the probability, that His leading secretaries would convert His movement into their own field of enjoyment, especially after His disappearance, He repeatedly used the provisional preposition if as a warning to His disciples. He did this especially in His letters. We have thus far reviewed 21 examples and excerpts from these letters of His using the preposition if, and it is now quite apparent that all of His warnings have proved prescient. We shall now discuss the last 7 excerpts in order to conclude this 4-part series. This is an excerpt from a letter of September 12, 1974, to one of his governing body commissioners. Regarding Madhavananda being the president, if he received the vote, why you have opposed? You must be impartial. My recommendation is that he must be the president. He has been chosen by the vote, and I am giving the casting vote for him. A few days later, about 4 days later, he writes to Madhavananda himself, who's supposed to be the president of the Bhaktivedanta Manor. Regarding the election there for president of the temple, I understand that you received the vote. So you should be the president. I am putting my casting vote for you. Well, guess what? Madhavananda was never allowed to be the president of Bhaktivedanta Manor because the governing body commissioner at that time for England wanted somebody else. Even though Prabhupada's disciples, and they were all his initiated disciples in 1974, at least those who were initiated in the temple, voted for Madhavananda. And Prabhupada said, I am casting the vote for Madhavananda. And Prabhupada also said, I want him to be president. He is to be made president. That's called an order Disobeying the order of the spiritual master is one of the 10 great offenses in chanting the holy name of the Lord. But this just goes to show, Prabhupada says, if he received the vote. Prabhupada already knew he did receive the vote, but nevertheless, in a diplomatic way, Prabhupada used the preposition if. But if he received it, and he did receive it, then he is to be president, but he was not made president because by this time, even by September of 1974, actually it was earlier than this, and to be specific, it was really in late 1973 that the governing body commissioners decided to do their own thing, and that was in the context, of course, of the plainclothes, quote-unquote, Sankirtan, which Prabhupada never wanted, but we shall discuss that in a future discourse. But here in September of 74, Prabhupada says to one of his leading secretaries, one of his original disciples, and yes, this man was one of the 11 pretender Mahabhagavats, not the worst of them, in fact, in my opinion, the best of them, as if you can use the word best, but that's my personal perspective. Nevertheless, he discards the order and makes somebody else the president. These were not rare occurrences, but the devotees, the real workers, who were not implicated and entangled in the leadership, were generally unaware that these men, these so-called leaders, were doing their own thing, and already in the process of converting Prabhupada's movement from ISKCON into quote-unquote ISKCON, so-called ISKCON. So here we see the order being neglected, and therefore we get early evidence of this, and we'll get plenty more. The next letter is the same letter we just quoted. It's just a later part of the letter of September 12th, 1974, to that particular governing body commissioner. Don't do anything whimsically without consulting me. I made the GBC to give me relief, but if you do like this, then where is the relief? It is anxiety for me. This is the difficulty, that as soon as one gets power, he becomes whimsical and spoils everything. What can I do? Let's read this one again. This is such a powerful excerpt. Don't do anything whimsically without consulting me. I made the GVC to give me relief, but if you do like this, then where is the relief? It is anxiety for me. That is the difficulty. That as soon as one gets power, he becomes whimsical and spoils everything. What can I do? This pattern of whimsical activity on the part of his quote-unquote best men was already well established by the mid-70s. Prabhupada therefore left us prematurely, because his movement was being ruined, as stated here, spoiled by his leading secretaries, because they were doing their own thing. They were already creating a new movement even at this time. Of course, that exploded exponentially after Prabhupada departed, but it was already going on. Now, everybody, or most everyone at this time, back in the 70s, was thinking that the GBC men were the best men. Although, from our perspective now, we can see that Prabhupada created big positions for big egos in order to lump them together so that they would work as checks and balances, sort of like crisscrossing shallow earthquake faults. They would buffer each other and keep those material ambitions that they had, that they each were harboring, at least partially in check or limited to a zone, you could say. But we must also remember that in the early letters, it's confirmed, and it was well known, that Prabhupada created the governing body commission so that he could step back out of management. After all, he was an elderly man, not in very good health. He was taking on a lot of bad karma, sanchita karma, from disciples, not necessarily being generated after they're initiated, but they came in with a boatload. And he wanted to be able to concentrate on his translations, his transliterations, and his purport to the sacred scriptures, particularly the Bhagavad Purana, which had not been completed yet in 1974, and the upcoming Chaitanya Charitamrita. These were massive projects, and actually His Divine Grace never did complete the Srimad Bhagavatam. He got just barely into the 10th canto. But the management was supposed to be taken by his direct representatives, and he did call his GBC's direct representatives in one later letter. And then he was not to be bothered with it anymore. In fact, when I joined the movement in mid-February of 1972, I was told in no unspecific terms that you're really not supposed to write Prabhupada. And I never did, because I was told that's what he wanted. And that is confirmed in the letters, especially on February 16th, letters to one of his female disciples, a letter to one of his female disciples, which that actually happens to correspond when I moved into the temple in Madison. So the governing body commissioner, the commissioners were invested with immense power and perquisites, but accompanying that was responsibility, not whimsical activity, not disobeying his orders, and therefore actually increasing his anxiety and moving the management that he had to do up from having to do with sincere workers on the lower levels or medium levels and having to manage his governing body commissioners and their infighting and their disobedience and their whimsical activities. And therefore he said, what can I do? Actually, that what can I do, that was also in a letter that we've quoted previously. You are all mudhas, what can I do? And he was referring to the GBC men specifically, as well as some others. The point of the matter is that if you do like this, they were doing like that. He used the preposition if, again, but it was already going on. He was hopeful it could be reversed. It never was reversed. The next letter is from October of 1974, so basically a little less than 1 month later. Again, to another governing body commissioner, the one who was mostly implicated in plainclothes scam kirtan getting its initial traction in late 1973. I am training some of my experienced disciples how to manage after my departure. So if, instead of taking the training, if in my lifetime you people say, I am Lord of all I survey, that is dangerous conspiracy. Why would this warning be given? Why would there be any necessity for this kind of warning if that was not already percolating in his movement, because it certainly was. The poison is personal ambition, and his leading secretaries were loaded with personal ambitions. And they were also starting to become puffed up with their power, because the emphasis in a Krishna consciousness movement is always authoritarian. A Krishna consciousness movement is never totalitarian, but it does, if it's bona fide, represent totalism. The absolute truth means totalism. There's no such thing as absolute truth unless that truth is absolutely pervading everything at all times, everywhere. And it is. And that absolute truth culminates in Krishna consciousness. The Krishna consciousness movement, by its nature, was meant to be authoritarian and always will be of that nature. You follow the Guru. You do what he says. When he gives an order, you accept the order. When he says, please bring me some water, you don't say to yourself, milk's better than water. I'll bring him some really nice, rich buttermilk. No, he said he wanted water. He gave that order. You do what he says. But what was going on here, and is what is more than hinted in this particular excerpt, is that already there was a loose, perhaps not even yet vocalized or certainly not well planned conspiracy percolating. Sort of underground to some degree, but not completely. It was a conspiracy that, well, we have these zones. Prabhupada has had so many ideas, but now we're the one who is implementing the Krishna consciousness movement, and snap, crackle, pop, we can put all of these disciples of his under our whammy whenever we see fit because of the authority he's given us. But Prabhupada didn't use the word authority in this excerpt. He used the word power. Because they weren't genuine authorities even by that time. They were not fulfilling the responsibility to merit all the perquisites and all the power that they had. That was proven beyond a shadow of a doubt in late March of 1978. That cataclysm of the zonalist Acharya imposition, which ruined Prabhupada's movement. It took a little time because the movement had generated so much genuine spiritual power, but those 11 pretender Mahabhagavats unplugged the fan. It took a little while for the fan to stop spinning, but it's pretty much stopped spinning now. So he says, if you men are thinking like this, then that is dangerous conspiracy. That dangerous conspiracy is what they carried out in the late 70s, early 80s, and then in the mid 80s you had the second transformation. But it was in March of 78 where you had the first transformation. But that transformation was not really also abrupt. It had been gradually developing, and we get a hint of it here in October of 74. This is a letter from September of 75, so basically 11 months later, almost to the date actually, of that last excerpt. This one is just to an initiated disciple who is not a leader or a sannyasi. Prabhupada says to him, if you are sincere and your motive is pure, then everything will come out all right and you will be successful. If you are sincere and your motive is pure, then everything will come out all right and you will be successful. Now, in the tarot cards, there's this one figure from the original Egyptian where you have a pyramid and then you have a capstone on top of the pyramid and you have a lightning bolt striking the capstone, and then a king and a plebeian are falling off the top head first down to their doom. Now, we're not going to go into a in-depth discussion of this card, of course, but one commentator on the tarot called it eliminatio logica. That was quite perfect, because real logic eliminates all the other explanations. Now, he says in this letter to that disciple that if your motive is pure, everything will come out all right. Now ask yourself this question. Did everything come out all right in what appears to be Prabhupada's movement? That, of course, is a rhetorical question. Therefore, eliminatio logic, you can eliminate the idea that Prabhupada's leading secretaries had pure motives. They didn't, nor did they fulfill their responsibilities. This is not a diversion, but we shall return to this point very quickly. Nevertheless, on May 28th, 1977, in his room in Vrindavan, virtually all the governing body commissioners were present when the important questions were asked, and Prabhupada gave equally important, more important, but nevertheless cryptic answers to those questions, knowing full well what the motive was behind the questioners as well as most of the rest of those who were present, of the big leaders and their big egos. And when he was asked the question about initiations in the future, he said, "Regular guru, that's all. He becomes disciple of my disciple, just see." Some say that the last two words were "that's it." Not important. Either way is fine. Doesn't change anything. Regular guru, that's all. He becomes disciple of my disciple. First of all, when Prabhupada says he becomes disciple of my disciple, how can anybody buy into Ritvik? But we shall not digress into that. That also is eliminatio logica. But Prabhupada said, regular guru, that's all. Regular, it's an adjective. It means under regulation. Therefore, it means, again, eliminatio logica, everybody is engaged, especially the guru, in bhakti yoga. What's the regulation? It's called vidhi sadhana bhakti, which again, through logic, proves that you don't need to be an uttamadhikari to be a guru, although that's preferable. Who can deny that? But a genuine madhyamadhikari, and anyone who is madhyamadhikari is genuine, because he's fixed in devotional service. He's fixed in the mode of goodness at bare minimum. If he receives the order from his spiritual master to be a Diksha Guru, he can then initiate disciples as a regular guru, that's all. But is that what they did in March of 1978? Those 11 zones, were those zones headed by regular gurus? Of course not. Each and every one of them had these elevated seats, and they were all being worshipped by their own god brothers and god sisters in the beginning before they could get traction by initiating new disciples. And then when they brought those in, then out went the god brothers and god sisters who weren't completely surrendered to them. And the pranam mantras and the pod names. Now, this could have been stopped. This could have been stopped in March of 78, if just one influential GBC had stepped up to the plate and said, wait a minute, we were all in that room, May 28th, 1977, we were all there, and Prabhupada said, regular guru, that's all. What is this business that you're all going to now take Uttama Adhikari worship and become popes of the zones worldwide? This is not what he authorized. This is not what he wants. If just one stood up, that was their responsibility. All that power, all those perquisites, that was their responsibility, but nobody stepped up to the plate. Why? Because, returning to the letter we just quoted, the last excerpt, none of them had the pure motive. Therefore, everything didn't turn out all right. It turned out to be the mess we're now in. And that's why one of our websites is called returntosquareone.com, because that's what must be done. This does not mean you take the deities and wrap them in velvet and silk and throw them into a river or the ocean. Return to square one does not mean any such draconian measures. But it means returning back to where the thing went off the rails. This has to be done. And if it's not done, then the lies are going to continue multiplying. And such lies, this has nothing to do with pure devotional service. There's never a pure motive behind such institutional lying, institutional delusion. The next letter is once again September 75, a year later from when we started in this part 4. Once again to a governing body commissioner. He also was one of the 11 pretender Mahabhagavats. Briefly, this fellow, when he was dressed down by one of the elder female disciples at his temple, and was told straightforward that you're an envious man by imitating Prabhupada on that high seat. Briefly, he partially came to his senses, took the seat out of the temple, and said, I'm not an Uttamadhikari, I'm only a Madhyamadhikari. Of course, there is no accuracy to that. He's nowhere near being a Madhyamadhikari. None of those 11 men were anywhere near being Madhyamadhikaris. None of them were even Kanishtas. They were all Sahajiyas. But nevertheless, he gets a little credit for that, although they turned him around within a few days, and he was back on the seat. But here in this letter of September 75, Prabhupada writes him, but if Tamal Krishna flies 10,000 miles to lodge some complaint against Jayatirtha, what can I do? If you all leaders cannot work together, then how can you expect the others to cooperate with you? This is actually somewhat subtle what's being communicated here. Of course, if is used, if Tamal Krishna flies 10,000 miles, but once again, it had already taken place. But the preposition if was used, meaning that if this continues to go on, if you continue to do like this, what is being communicated here is that he gave them the responsibility and authority, carry on my movement and manage. That does not mean you infight with the others, and when you're not getting what you want because you're fighting with another governing body commissioner. And by the way, these two governing body commissioners that are mentioned in this excerpt, they're both now deceased. Both died violently. Both died horribly. One was dismembered and had his head cut off by his own follower. And another died in the middle of nowhere, in the middle of the night, probably while sleeping in the back seat of the taxi that crashed into the tree when the driver fell asleep at the wheel. Do Uttamadhikaris end up like this? Is this their legacy of how they die? nevertheless, we can't divert to this topic and lose the thread. The thread is that these fellows were engaged in trying to get more and more and more power, and they were infighting, like the bees in the hive are all biting one another to get the honey. And they were actually flying thousands of miles, and these are expensive tickets. We all know that. Spending Prabhupada's money, the movement's money, in order to come and talk to Prabhupada, lodge a complaint, get him to say something that they can convert, a one-liner, and then get the power that they want by saying, Prabhupada said. Well, what he said here is, what can I do? Once again, instead of managing on his behalf, managing the movement on his behalf and taking away all of that bothersome activity that he was engaged in the late 60s and very early 70s, they're not doing the job. Instead, they're fighting amongst themselves for power. And what more proof do we need of this than what transpired in the late 70s? And also, of course, we can't go into that right now, but how they then fought with one another after they achieved their zones, covering the whole world, by the way, where they were the sole power, ultimately the only Diksha Gurus for many years. Of course, I'm using the term Diksha Gurus here loosely because none of them actually gave genuine initiation. Because in order to give genuine initiation, you must be a genuine guru. There's a bit of a silver lining in that, isn't there? But we can discuss that later. And then, from Prabhupada's excerpts in the letters, excerpts of the letters, this was November 75. This was to a disciple, initiated disciple, who's now no longer affiliated with the fabricated so-called ISKCON. Prabhupada says to him, now has the GBC become more than Guru Maharaj, as if simply GBC is meant for looking after pounds, shilling, pence? The GBC does not look after spiritual life. That is the defect. All of our students will have to become guru, but they are not qualified. This is the difficulty. Let us read it again. It is so powerful and so specific. It hits the nail on the head. Now has the GBC become more than Guru Maharaj. Oh. As if, so if is used here, as if simply GBC is meant looking after pounds, shilling, pence. The GBC does not look after spiritual life. That is a defect. All of our students will have to become guru, but they are not qualified. This is the difficulty. If the GBC was not looking after spiritual life, then what was the meaning of the GBC? Prabhupada didn't say this using the preposition if they are not. He said they're not looking after spiritual life. It was specific. Where he used the preposition if, even that was not quite if, because he said as if, which is another level. Has the GBC now become more than Guru Maharaj? Well, after Prabhupada left, it became more than him, because it totally discarded and disregarded what he said was to be done. It totally did its own thing. And then when that didn't work, when the 11 pretender Mahabhagavats were exposed in such a way that the movement was about to crater, which it was about to crater in 1986, and especially in 1987. So much so that the RAG, the ISKCON World Review, even ran an editorial at that time. I remember reading it because getting truth from that organization was almost impossible, that newsletter, that newspaper, but actually admitted that Prabhupada's movement could collapse. Admitted that truth. And it is collapsing. It's expanding horizontally with various satellite centers for the purpose of gold-plated grifting in the name of book distribution, scam kirtan. That's been going on for years, and it has been fading also for years. But the GBC was the god that failed. And Prabhupada was making that quite clear to us, giving perhaps the last warning possible, hoping that maybe it could bail itself out, maybe they would come to grips with how much they were becoming deviated, completely absorbed in pound, shilling, pence, and power. And then Prabhupada in this letter says all of our disciples are to become guru. All of them. Not just 11 pretender Mahabhagavats who weren't gurus at all. The GBC instead did the massive disservice of putting a lid on Prabhupada's movement, a roof. He wanted all of his initiated disciples to become spiritual masters. Oh, then there's this rationalization. It only means Shiksha gurus. Nonsense. He wanted all of his initiated disciples to become Diksha gurus. But they weren't qualified, and that includes his governing body commissioners. Not only does that include his governing body commissioners, that especially includes them. They were actually at the bottom of the totem pole when it comes to qualification to be guru. Those 11 pretender Mahabhagavats, at the very bottom. That's why they engaged in the cataclysm that they did, because they are already Sahajis. They went way too far, and they couldn't pull it off. So now on to the bonus round. I've just recently been made aware by one of my godbrothers on the East Coast of a book recently published by Achyutananda Das. I have a very high opinion of Achyutananda Prabhu, by the way. I talked to him in the early 80s, and he gave me some really important nuggets that I still remember to this day and that I still preach to this day. So in this new book that he published called Blazing Sadhus, I'm going to have this mailed to me very soon by snail mail. Here's the quote. This International Society for Krishna Consciousness, ISKCON, is a great tool we can use to spread our Hare Krishna chanting. If it is not helpful, we can dissolve it. So we must be very careful. Let me quote this again. I'll shorten up the beginning. This ISKCON is a great tool we can use to spread our Hare Krishna chanting. If it is not helpful, so this fits in with the fact that all these quotes are provisional. If it is not helpful, we can dissolve it. Does that sound like something that's absolute? Or does that sound like something that's provisional? Of course, Prabhupada's movement that he created was provisional. Have we not proved this in the 4-part series with these 28 and now 29 examples? Does not any honest devotee have to now admit that Prabhupada's movement was always provisional in terms of whether or not it would prove to be the movement that spread the pure chanting, the pure philosophy of Hare Krishna to every nook and cranny of the globe. The fabricated so-called ISKCON Confederation is not going to be the tool. He was hopeful that it would be the tool. This quote from Achyutananda Prabhu was in the very early going. Achyutananda was one of the first disciples of Prabhupada, initiated disciples. So this was in New York City in the very beginning year. And also, from another perspective, Achyutananda Prabhu was the first disciple because he was the first disciple to stand up and dance while Prabhupada was playing the mridanga in Tompkins Square Park under the big oak tree. So in the very beginning, when ISKCON was still bona fide, had just been incorporated, it was called a tool. It was a tool to use, and it could be dissolved. And the fabricated so-called ISKCON Confederation should be dissolved. It should be exposed, which is what we are doing. Its momentum should be checked, and in due course of time, it should be dissolved, and all the devotees of Srila Prabhupada, the Supreme Personality of Servitor Godhead, should return to square one. Tattvamasi. Material nature is the mother, and the initiator for materialistic life, his Lordship Shiva, is the father and is also known as Triguna. Material creation is actuated by the mode of passion, and for many decades now, that has been the dominant mode in the fabricated so-called ISKCON Confederation. In this age of Kali, at first the mode of passion is prominent, and as such, passionate activities tend to be passed off as spiritual service in Sahaja cults, and the mode of goodness is thus adulterated in those organizations. A devotee in ISKCON, as well as one in any of its bogus splinter groups, such as Ritvik or Neomat, becomes implicated in forgetting his real identity and also forgetting the original reason that he came to Krishna consciousness in the first place. By cultivation of goodness, however, a glimpse of his actual spiritual nature can be regained. Due to the prominence of the mode of passion in ISKCON, however, that organization is no longer a conduit for spiritual or transcendental insight. Association with those Sahajiyas, those Sahajiya leaders, some of whom are cryptic Mayavadis, some of whom are sociopaths, as well as association with the subcults, which are concentrated around these people, cannot help you transcend the limits of the material modes. Such bad association cannot help you pass through the stages of Atmarama and ultimately realize the Supreme Personality of Godhead as a person in his true form, with his actual activities, paraphernalia, qualities, and associates. Membership in any progressive metaphysical organization is meant for that. It's meant for that, and ultimately meant only for that. And the fabricated so-called ISKCON Confederation is no longer, and as far as that is concerned, has never been, a progressive metaphysical organization. Prabhupada wanted something different. He wanted his society to facilitate these higher spiritual realizations, genuine spiritual intuition and insight. But he repeatedly used the provisional preposition and if in order to indicate that such realizations, even in his movement, were always provisional. Free will is what it is. Along with an explanation, we have given you now in this 4-part series 28 examples and excerpts, 28 examples plus a bonus example of where and in what context Prabhupada used the provisional preposition. Pragya, or higher intelligence, entails recognizing that a statement by the Guru may not be set in stone, but may instead be provisional. Hopefully, by having absorbed the messages given to you in this 4-part series, your intelligence has now developed that higher capacity. Sadeva Samya